Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, East Africans poured out grief and anger on social media in the wake of the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crash, with many criticizing foreign media coverage. What did you think of the reporting? Tell us in the YouTube chat, and I'll do my best to get your comments into the conversation.
Hi, I am Awal Alu. I'm a lecturer at Kiel University School of Law. You are in the stream.
157 people were killed on March 10th when Flight 302 crashed shortly after takeoff from Addis Ababa en route to Nairobi, Kenya. Victims represented 35 different nationalities. More than 30 Kenyans died, the most of any nationality on board, and nearly a third of those who died held African passports. But some observers have taken issue with coverage of the tragedy, saying it didn't focus enough on the African victims. The online publication, This is Africa, started a Say Their Names hashtag campaign to remember those who died. SOCRATES MBAMALU told us why the group launched the initiative.
We at This is Africa started the Say Their Names hashtag in order to give a face and stories to the numbers of people that are dead during the Ethiopian crash. We felt the need to go beyond numbers and to give names and to give faces and to give stories behind those that were involved in the crash. We felt also that not many channels or not many media houses were focusing on the stories of these individuals that died in that crash. And we felt that to tell the African story properly, to remember these victims properly, we had to dig deeper for that.
Joseph Waithaka was traveling back to Kenya after visiting his son in the UK. Jane Kamau had been in Cairo, Egypt, attending a conference on childhood cancer. And PhD candidate Anne Burundu had been visiting her family and also working on a proposal about sustainable water management. Those are just some of the people who lost their lives. So how could coverage of the tragedy have been better? Well, joining us now to help us explore that question in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Solomon DERSSO is the founding director of AMANI Africa, a Pan-African policy research and consulting think tank. In Nairobi, Kenya, Patrick Gathara is political commentator, writer, and award-winning cartoonist. And in Frankfurt, Germany, TSEDALE LEMMA is the editor-in-chief of the ADDIS Standard. Welcome all of you to the stream. I'd like to start on my laptop with one of the examples here, because I think that'll help us get into this conversation right from the start. This from the Associated Press, the famed news agency. They wrote March 10th, breaking, authorities say Canadians, Chinese, Americans, Italians, Indians, French, British, Egyptians among those killed in Ethiopian plane crash. This is what our community, for one, thought about that. Nehemiah says it's typical of US-based publications to forget that Africa consists of many countries, but the AP should know better. I'm curious as to why someone thought Egypt was worth a mention, but not Kenya. Patrick, I'm going to give this to you, but before I do want to share, in the interest of fairness here to the AP, they spoke to Nairobi News. You can see this here on my screen. This is why we didn't mention Kenya and Ethiopia in our tweet on the crash. And Lauren Easton, the director of media relations, says that it was because that tweet was only providing additional information about the nationalities of people on board, and that they had already reported that Kenyans and Ethiopians had died, although Nairobi News says they found no tweets on the AP's timeline to support that assertion. Patrick, this is just one example. What did you think of the coverage of this tragedy?
Well, I thought it was pretty bad at the beginning. I think the AP tweet did set sort of a tone. We saw before, immediately after, there was sort of even just questions about the competence of Africans, whether Ethiopian Airlines had an awful track record, a safety track record, which was completely untrue, but that was a trope that was kind of being pushed. And this idea that it's an African airline sort of meaning that there are certain doubts about the competence of its people, it was something else that sort of kept being pushed. And I think that it is a tendency within international press to sort of make assumptions about what it means to be African. And to sort of bring that into their coverage and to make certain, or to carry around certain tropes, whether it's about violence or it's about ethnicity and how tribal Africans are supposed to be, and stuff. I think all this converges a lot in coverage of this place that is called Africa.
I want to share an example with our audience of what you're talking about right there, and talking about the safety record is one of the things that made the headlines. This from Business Insider India. You basically put a student pilot in there. The co-pilot of crashed Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 had just 200 hours of flight experience. And in it, they quote someone who says this. Our audience here, Adam, says, preliminary investigation revealed the crash was not due to human error, which led the whole world to ground the aircrafts. Unfortunately, some pilots in the West started to question the professionalism of the flight crew. I heard a pilot saying that the Ethiopian Airlines captain had only high school diploma.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I would just add that the TRT, the Turkish channel, had an interview where the anchor was really pushing the line that, Ethiopian Airlines has a terrible safety record, which is not true. And then again, speaking about hijackings, from the hijacking that happened in 1996, almost implying that is sort of a regular or normal, thing for Ethiopian Airlines, which again was true. And actually, her guest on her show had to correct and set the record straight. So I think there is a bit of a problem when it comes to these sort of assumptions of what it is or what it means to be African, especially to be sub-Saharan African.
TSEDALE, what does it feel to you as a journalist? Because you're looking at it from a slightly different angle.
Yeah, I do agree with what Patrick said, first and foremost. With Ethiopian Airlines, it started with that awful tweet from AP, which amounts to a complete erasure of the rest of the victims. But then it went on from a journalist from the Financial Times who was pretty much familiar with Ethiopia, I would say, who entertained the idea of the growth of the amount of growth Ethiopian Airlines had registered in the past. But then he said, but then there are so many questions. He wanted to link that with the growth of the Ethiopian Airlines, link the accident with the growth. So it went on like that. And then, the whole, most of the networks, including the CNN and MSNBC, had guests who were entertaining the idea that the pilots were somehow underperforming, were not ready, and, all sorts of ideas. In terms of, talking this from a journalist point of view, for journalists to say this, I would say there is no excuse for that. It's just a simple, lazy, reckless way of reporting. For example, asking if Ethiopian Airlines has a very terrible safety record in the past requires just a little bit of Googling, that the last accident Ethiopian Airlines had was in 2010, and this journalist was even referring to the 1996 crash. So there is that laziness, there is that recklessness of covering Africa, while being a Western journalist. But also there is that element into it that you are rushing to create a headline because you are catering to a corporate media that is, monetizing content. And so you are pushing that ridiculous headlines, and it will earn you money. So this is a combination of laziness, recklessness, and rushing for headlines that will generate you money. And the result is a very terrible one.
Laziness, recklessness, and basically clickable headlines that people will tap on. I want to share just one more example. Actually, this is a blog post that caught our eye. This is from a former journalist, Bahailu Mehireti, and he points to two examples in this post here. Pulled up two of them. The Wall Street Journal, jet crash in Africa, kills 157. And the other one here is from Bloomberg, Lion Air suspends delivery of Boeing MAX jets after Africa crash. So to the untrained eye, Solomon, maybe nothing is wrong with these headlines. What's your take on these headlines?
I would like to add a couple of points. I think the first one relates to this assumption that Africa is one country, and thereby anything happening in Africa being attributed to the whole of Africa, despite the fact that it may be an individual African belonging to, a particular country, a particular nationality who did something. It is the whole of Africa that is basically put and attributed to that person. So when a president does something terrible, there you go, an African president, as usual. And this relates to one important point, which is there is a certain image of Africa. And in making these kinds of reports, what some of these journalists are doing is basically feeding into that existing narrative and frame of mind and people's perspective about Africa. Those ideas that Patrick mentioned earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
The third point that I would like to add relates to the way incidents in Africa are reported, is in such a way that the human element of people who have died is completely put aside, and often it is a kind of reporting that basically tends to show either the sympathy of others or something that tends to show what others think of these incidents, okay, completely thereby ignoring and marginalizing that what happened was actually a human event, and the victims are human beings. And I think it's extremely important. It's extremely important to put this in context.
Patrick?
In the history of this continent.
Right.
If I may, I completely agree that this is a human tragedy. But I'll go back a little bit and say that one of the problems that we have and one of the issues we have is this very idea of Africa, you know, of that there's something called African that is defined. If you look at historically where this term came from, it wasn't ours. You know, it's a way of viewing the continent from outside, and it was introduced to us, and it was sort of were branded with it. You know, and I think that we've really got to start pushing back, because that term came with particular assumptions. You know, and we need to start rethinking about why is it that we accept it. You know, and how, if we want to have it, how do we redefine it? You know, because as Nyerere said, you know, it's only in relation to one another, I mean, to the white man, that we could look at one another and say we are one. But it's only in relation to them, you know, so in that sense, the idea of African is an external one. You only see Africa when you're standing outside of it. If we want to redefine it, then we need to start telling our own stories, you know, our own reporting to matter from within the continent, and not making these assumptions of sort of oneness as African, you know, that are kind of imposed upon us.
So this is a good way to segue into this tweet, because I think you would agree with this. Nunu on Twitter says, calling this erasure. What erasure does is endeavor to dismiss people of color through focusing only on white. This is what institutionalized global racism looks and sounds like, in which a minority elites are fearful of the magnification of, in particular, African success stories in the face of tragedy. So it's that idea of erasure there, TSEDALE, that I want to focus on, because I want to share some of the stories of those people that our audience says are being erased. We asked our community how they were affected by this tragedy, and this is the picture and the name of someone who was on that plane that was shared with us. He is a professor, or was a professor, Pius Edisamni, and the author of the book, You're Not a Country, Africa, A Personal History of the African Present. Someone in our community sent us this video comment because they wanted to share what he meant to him. This is Moses. Have a listen.
I'm here to talk about Mr. Pius Edisamni, who died last week. He's my friend. He's a very, very close friend to me. But before his death, he actually impacted meaningfully to my life. Though he lived a very short life, he's a mentor, he's a teacher whom I've learned from. He taught me to be courageous.
TSEDALE, what do you know about some of the other people who were on that flight? I know you've been talking to family members.
We, you know, first of all, the way we are dealing with this at ADDIS standard is that we've decided to create a scrapbook for the victims, and get a special digital edition, you know, and collecting the pictures, and also a little bit of a biography of the victims. And it's an extraordinary emotional task for us. What we are doing is put a face and also a bit of who they are in this compilation. And we've decided there that, okay, tragedy is as much about the victim, as much about the mourning people, as it is about the victims. And we wanted to reach out as much as possible to the families of the people, whether or not they are willing to have their, wives or husband and children featured in this scrapbook that we are producing. So we've so far covered about 30 of the victims, and we're working on that one because I felt like, yes, tragedy is as much about the people who have died as it is also about the people who are mourning them. And what about that space? These are individuals, these are people with emotions, with, every feeling that you could ever imagine. So they're not just numbers. They have a way of telling their stories. And we wanted not to press too hard on highlighting that part of the victims. It's important to bring them, but it's also important to get the consent from the families on whether or not they would like them to be, featured in this way. So this is how we are handling it right now, and we're still working on that. And it's an extraordinary work for us.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just ask whether the
Go ahead.
Scrapbook is a scrapbook for all victims, or is it specifically for victims from Africa?
It's for all. It's for all, because all of them are, it doesn't make any sense to make any differentiation,
exactly,
because they've all have been victims of the same tragedy. So we are trying to pull all. It would have been a lot easier if Ethiopian Airlines had released the passenger ledger. It's not. So what made our work so hard is that we are getting bits and pieces of information every day, and we're trying to reach out to the people, whether to seek for their consent, because this would be then the digital archive of the victims. And we're also doing that in honor of the safety record of Ethiopian Airlines. And so it's going to be an incredibly difficult work, but we will be pushing on that one and putting the pictures and who they are in this digital archive that we wanted to create for the victims.
I wanted to share this tweet, Solomon. I wanted to share this tweet. I wanted to get a couple of community members in. Muma says, "Is the criticism fair? Yes. Am I surprised? No. If the plane was full of pure Africans, the international coverage would have ended long ago. The Western media sidelining during such events is one thing we Africans have already gotten used to." And this comment on YouTube from Ao says, "Africa needs a media organization that covers the continent. In this day and age, it's not only a good way to spread awareness, but it just makes good business sense." Solomon?
Yeah, I would like to just make mention of the fact that a number of people, particularly family, friends, colleagues of people who have been involved in this, who lost their lives in this accident, have been trying on their part to give face the human dimension, what these people meant for them as colleagues, as friends, as family members. I think reinforcing those stories is extremely important in order to underscore the fact that what we are talking about here is not just numbers, as have been said earlier on. In terms of what this means for us, as I said earlier, it's important to put this in context. Mm-hmm. There is history that's associated with the way Africa is covered. This is not the first time that events in Africa are covered in this extremely unprofessional, biased manner. I don't think that it's going to be the last time either. Mm-hmm. You may recall, for example, the terrorist attack in Kenya, how raw images of victims have been published on the New York Times, creating a great deal of outrage, understandably so. The raw images of other people do not ordinarily get published, but those of Africans, it gets published exactly because of what I said earlier on, which has to do with creating this image of Africa as a victim. Mm-hmm. And it is one of the narratives that we, as Africans, need to take responsibility for. Mm-hmm. What that means is basically it shouldn't just be as the story of the lion and the hunter is told. It's always the hunter that tells the story. But the most important story is the story that the lion tells about the hunting. So I think it's extremely important that we as Africans take responsibility for how stories are told. And in saying so, we are not actually asking for African stories to be told in a politically correct way, basically ignoring or avoiding the negative things that are happening in Africa. That's not the case. African stories need to be told in their full dimensions. The
Patrick?
good, the bad, and the ugly. That is the most important thing.
So Solomon, I hear your point there, Solomon. I think Patrick has something to reply. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Solomon has said. The thing I wanted to add is that there are two dimensions. This goes back to the tweet the one of your viewers had put up when he talks about having a national or a continental news agency that tells our stories. I think we really need to get much better at how we tell our stories and to understand that actually many of the mistakes and errors that I've seen on international press are actually very present in African media. If you look at how, for example, Kenyan media covers Nigeria or how it might cover Benin, it's got many of the very same tropes because basically they borrow their coverage from the international agencies such as AP and Reuters, etc. So they actually replicate many of these problems. So we need to get better within the continent at reporting ourselves. The second thing is, as we saw, also in this case of Ethiopian Airlines and with the Kenyan terrorist attack, Africans are not just victims. People do stand up and they do protest against unfair coverage, and I think we should encourage that. We've seen in Kenya when CNN, for example, called us a hotbed of terror, or has pretty much several times consistently tried to portray us as a violent place. We've seen Kenyans come back and push back on this, online, and actually force this sorts of coverage to be taken down. So I think that it's not just about us sitting back and complaining about it, but being able to actually get together and challenge this.
If I may come in
here. TSEDALE was nodding her head first. I'm going to give it to her first. Go ahead, TSEDALE.
I think I do agree with what Patrick said. And one of the most extraordinary things that we have seen last week, while we were going through this very emotionally charged time, is the way Ethiopians came together. I mean, this is extremely rare for us to come together and agree on defending one thing. And it was an extraordinary moment to witness that all Ethiopians have rallied behind their airline. It's an airline which other times we don't really agree on many other things, with the airline or what it represents or how it represents in Ethiopia to the rest of the world. We always debate about these things, but when it came to this one, we really rallied behind and pushed back so hard. And I think this is a big lesson for us in being in charge of telling our own stories and not letting, in this digital era, not letting any of those mistakes slip up and become our stories the next day. So we've done that one. And I think this kind of defense has to continue. And I do hope this experience with Ethiopian Airlines is providing us a very strong and powerful example to continue with that.
TSEDALE, you are on the same brain wavelength as our community. Solomon, I heard you there, but we're just at the end of the show, so I have enough time.
Just 1 point, if I may.
I have just enough time to read this last tweet before we go. This is a black lad who says that it is about time that we as Africans covered our own events and stories. Poor journalism by the Western media must also get better. Solomon, DERSSO, Patrick Gathara, and TSEDALE, LEMMA, thank you so much. You can continue this conversation online by following us on Twitter. We are at AJStream. We'll see you next time.